Hello, this is Mike Smulligan with the Michigan Forest Stewardship Program, and I'd like to introduce you to a new program called Forest to My Faucet. Forest to My Faucet is essentially about where your drinking water comes from and the impacts that land use has on water quality and how forests are the best land use to protect our drinking water here in Michigan. Forest to My Faucet is a new project with lots of partners and doing some fun activities, and we'll explore that. And then we'll close by looking at some ways that you can protect drinking water in your area. Fundamentally, Forest to My Faucet is about the connections between our land and our water. And I want to explore land use and how we're taking care of our forests and land and water here in Michigan. Forests are a significant part of Michigan with over 20 million acres. That's more than half of our land area. Forests are a larger land use than agriculture or wetlands or urban areas. And we manage our forests here in Michigan, and that contributes to our economy in the neighborhood of $21 billion in our forest products industry. Now, when we talk about $21 billion forest products industry, many people want to know, are we taking good care of our forests? And we'll explore some of those ideas and take a look at forest certification and setting forth good standards of taking good care of forests and managing them well. We have even more water in Michigan than we have forests, with over 26 million acres of water in the state. 95% of that is our portion of the Great Lakes. Michigan has administrative control over 45% of the Great Lakes, and that's 25 million acres, which is significantly more than the 1 million acres of inland lakes. That is a significant amount of water with 11,000 lakes that are greater than 5 acres in Michigan. We have 76,000 miles of rivers and 3,000 miles of Great Lakes shoreline. Now, the Great Lakes are 20% of the world's available fresh water supply. And because Michigan is responsible for 45% of the Great Lakes, that's 9% of the world's available fresh water supply that Michigan is responsible for taking care of. Now, water is a public good. We don't estimate the value of water because we say that it's owned by the public and it's priceless. But equally important as the question of are we taking good care of our forests is the question, are we taking good care of our water here in Michigan? And we'll explore some data that indicates that we have some opportunities for improvement in terms of taking care of our water here in the Great Lakes state. Water is a pretty big topic, and so we're going to try to narrow our focus on drinking water. And in Michigan, we've got about 10 million residents, and about 25% of Michiganders live in rural areas and get their drinking water directly from a well, usually at their home. And we have about 1.25 million wells in Michigan. So for every 2 people living in rural areas, there's 1 well out there. And the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy permits those wells and tracks them, and you can actually go to this well water viewer on Eagle's website and find out where all the wells are in Michigan. About 75% of Michigan's 10 million people live in urban areas. And most of those folks are getting their drinking water from their municipal water utility. Now, there's a few large cities in Michigan that are getting their municipal water supply from groundwater, from wells. Kalamazoo, Lansing, Jackson, Gaylord, Cadillac are an example of the 1.8 million people in urban areas in Michigan that get their drinking water from groundwater. There's a few cities that get their drinking water from surface water from rivers. It's a pretty short list, but Ann Arbor is the biggest city in Michigan that gets their drinking water from the Huron River. And a few other small cities get their drinking water from rivers, and Flint a few years ago was using the Flint River as the source of their drinking water, and they are now back on the Great Lakes Water Authority. Now, the Great Lakes Water Authority provides drinking water for about 4 million people in southeast Michigan in 8 counties and 112 communities, including Detroit, Michigan's biggest city. So almost 6 million people in Michigan are getting their drinking water from the Great Lakes. Marquette, Traverse City, Grand Rapids, they're all getting their drinking water from the Great Lakes. If you want to find out where your drinking water supply comes from, go to midrinkingwater.org and you can find out where your municipal water supply gets its water source. Now, if 6 million people in Michigan are drinking from the Great Lakes, I have a question for you. Which Great Lake would you prefer to drink from? If you had to go dip a glass directly into one of the four Great Lakes surrounding Michigan, would you rather drink from Lake Superior or Lake Huron or Lake Michigan or Lake Erie? Well, I would recommend drinking from Lake Superior rather than from Lake Erie. And that's in part because the waters of Lake Superior are surrounded by forests. The watershed surrounding Lake Superior is 91% forest and only 1% agriculture and 2% urban. Lake Huron is two-thirds forested and 22% agriculture, 6% urban. Lake Michigan and Lake Ontario are similar, with about half of their watershed being forest, about a third being in agriculture, and around 10% being urban. But Lake Erie, the shallowest and the most southerly Great Lake, is 19% forest in its watershed and 61% agriculture in its watershed and 18% urban in its watershed. Now, it's not too surprising that as forest cover declines, so does lake water quality. Each year, the EPA puts out a State of the Great Lakes report, and it's very interesting to see that the quality of the lake is correlated with the amount of forest in the watershed. You see that Lake Superior and Lake Huron have a good status according to the EPA report, and they've got 91% and 67% forest in their watershed. Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan, they're in fair condition, and they're kind of at a tipping point with about 50% forest in the watershed. Lake Erie is in poor shape, and it's only 19% forest in the Lake Erie watershed. Oftentimes we'll use red, green, or red, yellow, and green, for the stoplight colors to indicate good, bad, or moderate. But I'm using green here to indicate the color of Lake Erie, and that photo at the bottom here is an actual photo of Lake Erie to indicate the algal blooms that Lake Erie is suffering from. Now, as forest cover declines, pollution increases. TMDL is the total maximum daily load, and that is something defined by the Clean Water Act as the maximum amount of pollution that is allowed to be discharged into surface waters. And so here in Michigan, EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, establishes a TMDL on watersheds that are polluted and sets a limit on the amount of pollution that is allowed to be discharged into that water. And you see here on the map that it's in the southern part of the state where most of the TMDLs are located. Now, there are some TMDLs in northern Michigan associated with industrial use, but most of the TMDLs, certainly the ones that are associated with land use, are in the southern part of the state where we have the fewest forests and the most farms and factories and people. Let's take a closer look at the TMDL for E. coli. E. coli is a bacteria that lives in the intestinal tract of warm-blooded animals, and E. coli is an indication of too much feces in our water supply. And EGLE did some very interesting analysis looking at the correlation between land cover and the location of these polluted watersheds. And the watersheds where we have too much feces in the water are highly correlated with agricultural land use and also highly correlated with people, urban areas, and even rural septic systems. E. coli pollution is negatively correlated with forests and riparian buffers. So where we have lots of forest and where we have lots of trees in the buffer zone between land and water, we have very few of these polluted watersheds with, polluted by E. coli and feces from animals and people. Unfortunately, these riparian buffers are negatively correlated with agricultural land use. So um, if we take a closer look at the source of all of this E. coli and feces getting into our water, looking at both human and animal supply, you can see here that we have a lot of combined sewer overflows where our urban water treatment facilities are not able to handle large rain events. And when we have large rain events, where sanitary sewer is still combined with the storm sewers, we get these large overflows. And you can see in 2021, the last report from Eagle on the combined sewer overflows, there were 383 combined sewer overflow events that discharged 47 billion gallons of sewage into our rivers and lakes and Great Lakes. Now, 38 billion gallons was coming from retention treatment basins, which were partially treated, and some of the solids had settled down. So 38 billion gallons was partially treated, but 9 billion gallons of untreated raw sewage was discharged into our rivers and lakes in 2021, with cities like Detroit and Dearborn and Lansing and some of the other municipalities in Wayne County being the primary sources of the untreated raw sewage. Now, if you go to michigan.gov/sewage discharge, you can find daily reports on combined sewer overflows. And I looked at that, today, and there were combined sewer overflows reported just this week. Now, urban areas are not the only sources of sewage into our waters. Rural systems rely on individual septic systems at every home. And Michigan State and other researchers believe that around a quarter of our rural septic systems are in need of repair and could be discharging untreated sewage into groundwater in rural areas. Now, when it comes to the agricultural side of too much feces in our water, agriculture is a very large industry here in Michigan, and there are currently 290 concentrated animal feeding operations that are large farms that are regulated by the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, because these large CAFOs are considered point source pollution according to the Clean Water Act. And at these 290 CAFOs, we have a lot of animals. 400,000 cows, 700,000 pigs, almost 800,000 turkeys, 22 million chickens. And all of those animals produce 4 billion gallons of liquid manure every year, excuse me, and 1.3 million tons of dry manure. And most of this manure is spread on the land. Now, Eagle updated the general permit in 2020 and required farmers to use a 35-foot permanently vegetated riparian buffer and a few other limitations on the spreading of manure, both the timing and the amount of manure. Unfortunately, Farm Bureau has sued, and this permit, which is attempting to protect our waters from manure, is being held up in court at the moment. Now, MDAR does have a voluntary spill response team, but it's not utilized very much. In 2021, only 4 spills were reported, and somewhere around 400,000 pounds of materials were applied on the land as a response to this voluntary spill. It's difficult to find public data on manure spills from agricultural systems. Eagle has very transparent data on the combined sewer overflows from urban municipal treatment facilities for humans, but it's challenging to find data on agricultural spills into our waters. But if you just Google manure spills in Michigan, you will find quite a few occurrences of large manure spills that are coming from agriculture into our waters. So going back to the EPA State of the Great Lakes report, their technical report has lots of really interesting information about land use, and also this particular map here is showcasing riparian zones and looking at the forest cover in that 100-foot area where the land and the water are coming together. And you see here that the same trends for forest cover in the entire watershed are pretty similar for the amount of trees that are in that 30-meter or 100-foot riparian zone where the land and the water are coming together. So you see that we have a lot of trees in the riparian zone in Lake Superior and Lake Huron, even in Lake Michigan and Lake Ontario. But poor Lake Erie, there's just not very many trees in that riparian zone, and that's likely because 60% of its watershed is agriculture. Now, land use isn't the only source of contamination of our water supply here in Michigan. There are plenty of industrial and other sources of contamination that are impacting our water quality. Eagle also puts out TMDLs, or total maximum daily loads, for other types of pollution. Here you can see on the left that map is the PCBs. This is the TMDL for PCBs. So everywhere that you see green is TMDL for PCBs, and PCBs are atmospherically deposited. That's why they're so widespread across the state. Same with mercury, the middle map. Mercury is atmospherically deposited, often by coal-powered power plants. They're getting mercury up into the atmosphere, and that is coming down atmospherically. So you can see that we've got 743 lakes and rivers that are impaired by mercury in Michigan, and a pretty significant amount was almost 7,000 miles of river and 250,000 acres of lakes that have a mercury TMDL. Now this map on the right is showing in red all the waters of the state that have a fish consumption advisory. Now, if you're an angler, whenever you buy a fishing license, you may look through the little fishing guide to get some information about the fishing regulations. And if you've ever gone looking for the information about what is the fish consumption advisory for the river or lake where you like to go fishing, the reason it's not in that short 50-page fishing guide is because there are 3,116 pages of fish consumption advisories at michigan.gov/eat-safe-fish. So our industrial activities have significantly impacted our water quality here in Michigan. And if you're an angler, if you like to eat fish, I highly recommend going to that michigan.gov Eat Safe Fish so you can learn what are the potential risks of eating different types and different amounts of fish in the rivers and lakes where you like to go fishing. Now, industrial use has also impacted not only fish, but even mammals. In 2018, the DNR and Eagle, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and the Department of Public Health issued a do not eat advisory for deer when hunters were hunting over by Oscoda, over by the Wurtsmith Air Force Base, where they were using PFAS in firefighting foam. And there was so much PFAS in the environment that deer were actually accumulating this PFAS in their tissues. So humans are certainly having an impact on our environment here in Michigan in ways that are harming our water. The EPA actually has 65 Superfund sites in Michigan. Now, I haven't read through all of the information about all 65 Superfund sites, but I'm guessing that many of them are near water. And I'd like to highlight one Superfund site in Michigan because I have a loose connection to this particular community. So St. Louis is a small town about an hour north of Lansing. It's the geographic center of the Lower Peninsula. And before I joined the Department of Natural Resources, when I was a consulting forester, I wrote a nice forest stewardship plan for their school forest that's on the southeast side of town. And recently, I've been working with a consulting forester who is planting trees at the school forest using some funding from the Forest Service and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. But I didn't realize it until recently, but St. Louis, Michigan is one of the 65 Superfund sites in Michigan. And that's because there was a chemical company, Michigan Chemical Company, that was later bought out by the Valsicol Corporation, that has been producing, that was producing chemicals in St. Louis at a plant right on the shores of the Pine River there back in 1936, and one of their most popular products was DDT, an insecticide used by the military during World War II. And this particular Michigan Chemical Company is rather infamous in Michigan. If you were alive in 1973, you might remember that in 1973, this particular chemical company put PBB in dairy feed bags. So this particular chemical company manufactured both PBB, which was used as a fire retardant, and they also produced nutrient supplements for dairy cattle. And the PBB was branded as Firemaster, and the dairy supplement was branded as Nutrimaster. Well, they ran out of bags for the well, they made a mistake and they put PBB in the Nutrimaster bags and shipped this off to a Farm Bureau feed supply in Battle Creek, and this contaminated the food supply for cows and other animals all across Michigan. And this resulted in 23,000 cows being killed. And if you were alive in Michigan in 1973, there's a good chance that you to this day have elevated levels of PBB in your bloodstream. Well, this tragic accident obviously was not good for business, and resulted in this plant closing down in 1978. Well, unfortunately, this site was highly contaminated. This company was dumping its waste into the river, and even after the plant closed, DDT and other chemicals continued to leak into the Pine River. And there was a lawsuit in 1982 to clean it up, and that actually didn't work. And years later, in 1998, they discovered that the fish in the river were still full of DDT, and it was getting worse. And so this Superfund site has been in process of being cleaned up for 40 years at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's still not done. It's still ongoing. You can see, there's a bench outside this site on the right where the Pine River Superfund Citizens Task Force is declaring that they are trying to restore the land in the river to its natural condition so it's safe for any use. But even now, in 2023, it's not safe to go swimming in the water. It's not safe to eat any fish that are in that Pine River. And all that chemicals continues to migrate downstream, and is a tragic situation where this chemical company was dumping chemicals in the river and didn't dispose of their waste properly. Now, out of these 65 Superfund sites, here's a couple more that are on water and associated with the forest products industry. So both of these are historical situations where paper mills back in the 40s and 50s and 60s were disposing of their waste either directly into the rivers or the lakes for a short period of time, or using sewage lagoons to evaporate the waste, but the sewage lagoons did not contain the waste. And so these are two Superfund sites. One is up in Manistee, where a paper mill owned by Packaging Corporation of America was causing some pollution back in the 50s and 60s. And this became a Superfund site back in 1983. And in this particular case, this is some groundwater contamination that is is not significant enough to require remedial action. The uh, um, the company PCA built a water treatment facility in 1972. So for the last 50 years, has been properly treating the water, and so this 70-year-old contamination is declining in terms of concentration and size, and there wasn't a need to do remedial action at that particular site. But the EPA continues to monitor this plume of contamination in the groundwater, just to make sure that it doesn't pose unreasonable health threats to humans and the environment. This other situation is down in Kalamazoo, where back in the 50s and 60s, Allied Paper and Georgia Pacific and a couple of other companies had 5 paper mills in Kalamazoo where they were making carbon copy paper, and PCBs were used to make carbon copy paper. And the wastewater from this treatment process was sent into lagoons, and again those lagoons leaked into the river, and there were so many PCBs leaked into the Kalamazoo River that they were detected 80 miles downstream in Lake Michigan. So even though this pollution was 50 years ago, this is still an active, ongoing EPA Superfund site where the EPA is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up and remove PCBs from the Kalamazoo River. So, enough about agriculture and urban areas and industrial pollution. How about forestry? Does forest management contribute to pollution? Well, the short answer is yes. These are some data from 2018 from the EPA looking at what is the source of pollution for our lakes and rivers here in the United States. This is national data, and you can see here that the most significant source of pollution is atmospheric deposition. And then other major sources are agriculture or urban stormwater or historical pollutants, like we were just looking at with those 50-year-old paper mills, municipal sewage. So there are lots of causes of water pollution, but forest management actually is one of them. It's listed at number 17 for lakes and number 10 source of pollution for rivers. The primary source of pollution that forest management is contributing would be sediment. There's very small and infrequent chemical spills. Maybe some equipment might blow a hydraulic line and spill, tens of gallons of hydraulic oil. So chemical spills are rare and small in forestry, but managing forests and having large equipment operating out in the woods can be a source of sediment going into lakes, but particularly into rivers. Now, Forest To My Faucet is primarily about water quality, but I do want to have a little bit of information about water use, because how we use water here in Michigan is often a contentious issue, and bottled water companies are often taking the brunt for how we use water. If water is a public good, the public often complains that for a mere $200 permit for a well, companies shouldn't be allowed to extract and bottle and sell hundreds of millions of gallons of water and outside the Great Lakes watershed. However, bottled water companies are a relatively tiny amount of the water that's used in Michigan. You can see that making snow at our ski resorts or golf courses are using a whole lot more water than the bottled water companies. And the biggest users of water are power generation and public water supply, industry, and agriculture. Now, EGLE, which is the source of these data, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, they distinguish between total water use and consumptive water use. Because some of the biggest users of water, like the power companies, they're basically borrowing the water. They're they're sucking in a lot of water from rivers and the Great Lakes to cool their power plants, but then they're returning most of that water back to the lakes or the rivers. Now, there may be some thermal pollution associated with that, but for the most part, companies are just borrowing the water. The biggest user of consumptive water is actually agriculture, where there's 2,164 wells to use to irrigate agriculture, and farmers are only withdrawing enough water to irrigate the crops, and the water is either evaporating from the land or being exported off in the crops, and so agriculture is actually the largest consumptive user of water in Michigan, followed by power generation and then public water supply, and then industry. You can see that bottled water is just a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of consumptive water here in Michigan. Now, one large user of water that's exporting water out of the Great Lakes watershed that other states really ought to be more aware of is in Illinois, where the city of Chicago back in 1900 completely reversed the flow of the Chicago River. So rather than flowing into Lake Michigan, the city of Chicago dug a canal to connect the Chicago River with the Des Plaines River and the Mississippi River watershed. And that's because the Chicago River in 1900 was Chicago is dumping raw sewage into the Chicago River, and that raw sewage was flowing into Lake Michigan, which was its drinking water supply, and many people were dying of typhoid in Chicago in the late 1800s because the Chicago River was and all their sewage was polluting their drinking water supply. So Chicago, instead of treating their sewage and discharging clean water into the river and Lake Michigan, they dug a canal that reversed the flow of the Chicago River so that instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, that is now draining Lake Michigan. And this particular Chicago sanitary and canal is rather infamous in current times because that is going to be where Asian carp and other invasive species are going to be entering into Lake Michigan. But that is also a huge drain out of the Lake Michigan and Great Lakes watershed, 2,000 times larger than the bottled water companies, where the city of Chicago continues to drain water out of Lake Michigan instead of being, flowing into Lake Michigan as it was historically. All right, so enough about pollution and water use. Let's start to look at the positives. Let's start to look at the good news. And so this is how forests provide clean water. Forests are the best land use for providing clean water because they have permanent vegetation that slows water, moving both vertically falling from the sky, but also horizontally moving across the surface. The undisturbed soil and the leaf layer reduces runoff and slows down that water and allows the water to infiltrate into the soil, and so it minimizes erosion. The soil and the vegetation filters pollutants as the water moves through the forest system. Forests have minimal infrastructure and impermeable surfaces. There's not a lot of large paved parking lots. There's not a lot of roads or buildings in forests. And so the water is allowed to infiltrate into the soil and move through the system slowly rather than draining off of a big paved parking lot directly into the water. Forests have infrequent and small chemical spills. And then because forests allow the water to move into the soil and move through the system slowly rather than a big parking lot shuttling lots of water into a stream quickly, forests do a good job of regulating the timing and magnitude of stream flow. So stream ecologists like to talk about, is a river flashy? Is it susceptible to flash floods? Well, if you have a large parking lot, whenever it rains, the water directly goes into the river, and the stream comes up quickly. It's flashy. It'll flash flood. That's not the case in forests. Forests do a good job of incorporating the water into the soil, and the water moves through the system slowly. So Forest to My Faucet is a project that showcases the connections between forests and our drinking water and how forests are protecting our drinking water. We've got a team of a dozen partners here that are working with the Forest Stewardship Program and the Forest Service, and we have a couple of regional conservation organizations, a few statewide associations of both landowners and loggers. We've got several watershed councils and a few land conservancies. And we're working together as a team with funding from the Forest Service to showcase how forests are protecting our drinking water. And we'd like to give credit to the Forest Service, which about 10 years ago came out with some really interesting spatial analysis at a national level of what are the important watersheds that we should be protecting to manage our surface drinking water. And so Forest to Faucets is a national data set that the Forest Service put together a dozen years ago to help prioritize what are the watersheds that we need to be working on and managing our forests well so that we can protect our drinking water. And it's hard to see that legend there, but the darker the purple, the more important that watershed is for protecting drinking water. And so the partners on Forest to My Faucet are going to be working primarily in those darker areas, where in the Upper Peninsula, Marquette is our primary focus. In the Northern Lower Peninsula, we're working in Traverse City and Alpena. And then in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula, working over on the Grand River watershed in Grand Rapids, and then working with the Huron River and other watersheds in southeast Michigan. Now, one of the major activities that the project's going to be doing is establishing new partnerships and relationships with municipal water utilities. So if 75% of people in Michigan get their drinking water from a municipal water utility, we want to help showcase how forests are helpful to protecting the drinking water supply for 75% of Michiganders. Now, water utilities will often develop a source water protection plan that identifies their source water protection area and identifies potential sources of pollution, and then identifies potential management options to protect their drinking water. And all of the partners on Forest to My Faucet are reaching out to water utilities in their service area to help them implement their source water protection plans, and to help them primarily with the non-point source pollution, looking at how land use is distributed in their service area, and helping these municipal water utilities engage with landowners to take good care of both forests and farms, and to take a look at how we do land use planning in urban areas. These partners will be helping water utilities with outreach and education to customers and the public, and showcasing how taking good care of the forests in the upstream part of the watershed provides direct benefits to providing cleaner water that is cheaper to treat and deliver to urban water users. And so one of the hopes of the Forest to My Faucet project is that we can help water utilities document how a heavily forested watershed with healthy and well-managed land is lowering their costs of treating drinking water. And if we can showcase how protecting forests and managing them well and expanding them in riparian zones will reduce their treatment costs, there's a possibility that water utilities might be able to partner with landowners in the upstream part of the watershed to incentivize good forest management. So what are the three forestry solutions that we're proposing in Forest to My Faucet? Well, we're looking at protecting forests, managing them well, and expanding forests in strategic places. About 38% of Michigan's forests are publicly owned, so more than 60% of Michigan's forests are privately owned. But we don't have a lot of conservation easements and preserves or protected watersheds in Michigan. Only 6% of Michigan's forests legally restrict timber harvesting. And so there's very few forests in Michigan that are managed for purely ecological values. And so we want to encourage protecting forests. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which, by the way, the United States is not a signatory, suggests protecting 17% of land. There are other conservation organizations around the world that are suggesting 30% of our land and water should be protected. Now, we also want to manage our forests well. And so Forest To My Faucet is going to be working with both landowners and loggers, showcasing logger training and using best management practices, recommending forest certification like the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, Forest Stewardship Council, or the American Tree Farm System. And we want to help landowners take good care of their woods and get them connected to people and programs that will help them be successful in their woods. And we also want to look at expanding forests in strategic places, specifically in riparian zones in both urban and rural areas. And partners on the Forest To My Faucet project will be planting 60,000 trees in both urban and rural areas. And the DNR, as part of our contributions to the project, will be planting 750,000 trees on state forests in areas that are identified by the Forest To Faucets as protecting drinking water supply. So our watershed councils and our land conservancies will be working on protecting forests, and land conservancies will be helping landowners consider conservation easements or maybe purchasing the land for the land conservancy to own as a nature preserve. Heart of the Lakes is an association of 30-some land conservancies in Michigan. So if you own forest land and a conservation easement is something that you're interested in to protect your land from development and to prevent land use change and encourage good land management, I encourage you to reach out to one of our partner land conservancies or find your nearby land conservancy at Heart of the Lakes. Our watershed councils on the project are also going to be working with local water utilities to help them implement their source water protection plans and looking at ways to protect areas in the watershed that are important for protecting clean water. Watershed councils do a lot of outreach and education for the public, and if you're interested in finding a watershed council near you, you can go to that watershed website there and find a watershed group in your area. One of the watershed councils we're working with is the Kalamazoo River Watershed Council, and I took this map out of their Kalamazoo River Watershed Plan, showcasing the land use in the Kalamazoo River Watershed. And you see here that the land use in the Kalamazoo River Watershed is approaching that of Lake Erie, where it's 47% agriculture and only 27% forests, 8% urban. So the Kalamazoo River Watershed is a highly agricultural watershed with not enough forest to protect the water quality in that area. In the last year or so, the city of Kalamazoo has started working with a forester in the area to develop some forest stewardship plans for some city-owned forests that are protecting the wells that are the source of the groundwater for the drinking water supply for the city of Kalamazoo. Now, as far as managing forests, we're working with both landowners and loggers. In landowners, we're working with the Michigan Forest Association to recruit new members, especially in the southern part of the state. The Forest Service does a National Woodland Owner Survey every 5 years, and only 29% of landowners in Michigan are using a forester for a timber sale. So because 100% of landowners use a logger for a timber sale, we also want to work with loggers so that we can help landowners be working with loggers that are doing good work in the woods and are helping them do their timber and forest management well. And so we're working with the Michigan Association of Timbermen to expand their master logger certification program. Now this map here, you see all those pins, those are 80 master loggers that are in the northern Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. But in the southern Lower Peninsula, where 80% of our population lives and about 18% of our forests are located, We don't have any master loggers. And so Forest to My Faucet is going to be working hard to recruit excellent loggers in the southern lower peninsula to become certified as Michigan master loggers. We'll be working statewide with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative to do logger training. And at logger training for SFI, loggers are trained on the best management practices manual that the state puts out, recommending the best management practices for protecting soil and water quality. And this little infographic here showcases 6 of the major best management practices: building roads properly, protecting wetlands, installing stream crossings in a way that prevents sediment from getting into the water, preventing and cleaning up any spills, managing the riparian zone well. The riparian zone is 100 feet or more where the land and the water come together, and we want to be extra careful of taking good care of the land near the water. We want to be able to prevent ruts. So we want to minimize ruts in upland areas and be extra careful to minimize ruts in that riparian zone near the water. And so it's important for loggers to understand how the good work that they're doing is protecting water quality for both aquatic organisms like fish and turtles, but also for protecting drinking water. We also want to be doing a lot of work with the Michigan Forest Association and the Michigan Tree Farm System and other landowner groups to do outreach and education to empower both landowners and the public to understand the connections between taking good care of their forest and protecting water quality. And so we'll be doing things like field days and workshops and town halls and engaging with landowners in throughout the state to understand the connection between forests and water. So Michigan Forest Association will be recruiting primarily in the southern part of the lower peninsula, and they'll be hosting field days to showcase the connections between forests and water. So if you're interested in attending a field day or a workshop to learn more about how you can take good care of your woods to protect water quality, go to michiganforest.org. Forest to My Faucets will be encouraging landowners to certify their forests. Forest certification is internationally recognized standards to help landowners showcase good land management. Certification define standards so we can evaluate and confirm good forest management. Forest certification also tracks and labels products through the supply chain so consumers know that they're buying wood that was or paper products that are sourced from responsibly managed forests. There are 3 major forest certification programs here in the United States: the Forest Stewardship Council, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and the American Tree Farm System. The American Tree Farm System is designed for family forest landowners with 10 to 10,000 acres. Sustainable Forestry Initiative is designed more for larger landowners, 10,000 acres and up. And then the Forest Stewardship Council is designed for both small and large landowners. And all 3 forest certification programs do a nice job of setting standards for good forest management and helping landowners take good care of their woods. Now, we'll also be working to expand forests and plant trees, primarily in riparian zones, the area where the land and the water come together. And the dozen partners on the project are going to be planting 60,000 trees in riparian zones in both urban and rural areas. The DNR, which plants 5 million trees annually on state forests, has pledged to plant 750,000 trees as part of the Forest to My Faucet project. And there's a lot of different organizations, both in Michigan and nationally, that will help landowners plant trees and in both urban and rural areas, provide funding. Arbor Day Foundation, One Tree Planted, American Forests all provide funding. Relief Michigan does a lot of work with urban forests in Michigan. And so there's a lot of opportunities to plant trees. We're excited about planting trees because planting trees empowers people. We've got 14 billion trees in Michigan, according to the Forest Service inventory and analysis, but we do need more. And planting a tree is a simple and inexpensive act that people can do to make the world a better place. I've presented a lot of data today about how the world is messed up and polluted, and both land use and industry and people and farms are polluting our waters. That's really discouraging. We want to empower people to do something positive for the planet. This photo here is some young people at the Frankfurt School Forest up by Traverse City. They've got a school forest and they are planting trees at their school forest. And you can see here that these young people are proud of what they were doing to manage their forest well. And being a couple miles away from Lake Michigan, they were pleased to learn about the connections between taking good care of their school forest and protecting water quality in Lake Michigan. One of our partners on Forest to My Faucet is Conservation Resource Alliance up in the Traverse City area. Conservation Resource Alliance does really good work taking good care of land and water up in the northwest corner of the Lower Peninsula. And they've got a really innovative program called Wild Roots, where they are partnering with local conservation districts in their region to help landowners purchase trees that are good for planting in riparian zones. And so conservation districts around the state will often have a spring and a fall tree sale, and Conservation Resource Alliance is partnering with those conservation districts to help landowners get access to packages of tree seedlings that are good for planting in riparian zones. And we're hoping that our partners will work with conservation districts or commercial nurseries in other parts of the state to help landowners decide what are good species to plant in their area that will help protect water quality. Now, there's a lot of funding available for clean water and source water protection. At the federal level, there's a lot of funding coming out in recent laws from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Both of those laws are making massive investments in clean water in terms of both better land use and infrastructure. So those are significant legislation in the last couple of years where the federal government is investing in clean water. The Farm Bill, which comes out every 5 years or so, in 2018, the Farm Bill, my favorite section in the Farm Bill is Section 2503, where the USDA is requiring that 10% of all of its conservation finance be invested in source water protection. And so the federal government has agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service and Farm Service Agency, the U.S. Forest Service, the Environmental Protection Agency. All of those agencies have excellent programs with generous funding to help people manage their land well and protect water quality. At the state level, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and the DNR, and the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development all also have funding sources to help landowners manage their land well and to protect water quality. And there's other sources of funding. Community foundations, national foundations provide funding for good land management and water quality protection. So as we wrap up with this presentation, I would like you to be thinking about what can you do? What are things that you can do to help protect forests in your area? What can you do to help better manage forests? Are there places where you can plant trees? Are there other things that you can do to protect drinking water? Maybe it's growing a garden. Maybe it's putting in a rain garden in an urban area. Maybe it's planting wildflowers and removing some of your lawn and putting in a pollinator garden instead of mowing your lawn up to the edge of the water. There's a lot of things that we can do to protect water quality. Maybe advocacy with policymakers at the county, state, or federal level is something that you can do to help protect our land and our water here in Michigan. Forest to My Faucets is showcasing how our 20 million acres of forests are incredibly important for protecting the quality of our 26 million acres of water and the 6.5 quadrillion gallons of water that are in the Great Lakes. That's a globally significant water supply, and it's really important that Michigan takes seriously its global responsibilities to take care of our water here in Michigan because, quite frankly, the rest of the planet's depending upon it. So thank you very much, and please get out there and do something to protect and manage and plant some more trees.